So I believe I alluded to in my video on the Lindy effect the fact that I tried to read a bunch of books on an NPR list of the best books of the decade, and that really reinforced for me the idea that I don't want to read books newer than 15 years old unless I know and like the author already. It comes strongly recommended by a specific person or author I trust, or, as I mentioned in another video, if it is a lit review sort of book, in which case, lit review, and I'd say for fiction the equivalent would be like best of the year short story anthology. So those are the three categories that I will still read books newer than 15 years old. But I wanted to talk about this NPR list and what happened there. So NPR put out a list of the best 50 science fiction and fantasy books of the decade, which the woman who ran my writing group at the time sent us. And I noticed that on that list there were 3 books I recommended. And this wasn't like books exactly, like a lot of the entries were series, so it was 50 books or series. But anyways, there were 3 books, or series in one case, that I recognized on that list, and I really liked all of them. So there was the short story collection, Exhalation Stories by Ted Chiang. There was the short story collection, The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, which I nominated, and it won December a year or two ago at my science fiction fantasy reading group, and everybody loved it, so it's not just me. This is a fantastic collection. I think this one is too, and these are 2 of my all-time favorite single-author short story collections of the modern era for science fiction and fantasy. So anyway, so these 2 books are on the list, and then Seanan McGuire's Wayward children's series was on the list, which this particular book wasn't even out when it came out, but I already pulled it for the gender video, so I have it, and I love this whole series. As I said, it's one of my favorite contemporary fantasy series, and interestingly, so I would say 3 favorite modern fantasy series, and 2 of them are series of novellas. So this is one, Nghi's Singing Hills Cycle is another, and then The Magicians by Lev Grossman, which is a series of novels. Anyways, so those 3 books or series were on the list. I really liked them, and I'm like, I should give some of the other books on this list a try. And so, looking at the list, the thing that sounded most compelling based on the description was this series, starting with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. And I read it, and this book was first self-published, and it's very obviously self-published. The plot basically follows the pattern of there's a problem, it gets resolved, there's a problem, it gets resolved, problem, it gets resolved, and so on until the end. On top of that, I love the character of Kaylee Fry from Firefly, but she has a Kaylee Fry ripoff character here who is extremely annoying. And then she soapboxes about autism twice. And as an autistic person, I didn't really appreciate the way she did that. So I had those 3 issues of the plot was too linear, or not enough stakes. I didn't like the Kaylee Fry derived character, and I didn't like the soapboxing about autism. But I still thought, okay, it was a self-published book. This seems pretty good for a self-published book. I'm going to read the second book in the series. And this one was written in a much more conventional fashion, but I felt like it didn't really have any of the soul of the first book. And I talked to someone who was actually, no, I really did like it because I liked the robot character and how that was presented, and maybe I'll try rereading it. But after this one had promise, this one worked less for me. I didn't end up reading the rest of the series, even though I bought the next book at least, maybe the next 2, but definitely the 3rd book. And so I was kind of disappointed by this one. And as a result of that, I have now heard people saying great things about her Monk and Robot series, but I am a lot more reluctant to read it. If I hadn't read 2 books in this series and been kind of disappointed by both in different ways, I would probably be much more willing to give Monk and Robot a try. But now it's going to take either a lot more people telling me it's an amazing series or someone I really trust telling me it's an amazing series to try it. So I would say this is a case against jumping the gun, because in this case, Monk and Robot might be a great series, but after these 2 books, I am less inclined to read it, and NPR is like, this is one of the best series of the decade. I really don't think it was. And then they jumped the gun and made me more skeptical about a series that might actually be a good series, and I know that, but I'm just less inclined to try it because of this. And then this one really, really pissed me off. So this series, they recommended, only this book was out at the time, and she ended it on the kind of cliffhanger where basically everything that happened in the book is irrelevant. And that pissed me off, but it was a really interesting world setting, and so I bought the second book when it came out, and she ended that on a cliffhanger that made everything else that happened in the book irrelevant. And at that point I'm like, okay, I am done with this writer completely. This is not something I think is acceptable to do with books. It's a really interesting world, but that doesn't justify writing books this way. And so I never read the third book that came out. I don't know if it finished the series satisfyingly, but both of these books were unsatisfying because they basically said, oh, actually, this whole thing became irrelevant. Here's a new problem. And so, again, when this list was out, there was only this book. And so how do you say that one of the best series of the decade has only one book out, especially a book that does this whole cliffhanger changing all the stakes thing? And so at this point I was like, okay, I am really starting to doubt the judgment. And I will note, the series did something interesting that I appreciate, which is they had the series divided into reasons people read books and tried to recommend books based on that. But of course, I was trying to read them all. A lot of people were, and I prioritized the reasons I related to. And I forget what reason they recommended this series, but I gave it too much of a chance. I really should have, when she did this thing with this book where she made everything that happened irrelevant with a cliffhanger, I should have not tried the second book, but I gave her a second chance. She did the same thing, and I'm done with the series. And it would take someone who has given me multiple great reading recommendations telling me Rebecca Roanhorse wrote a new series that is absolutely amazing and you should read it, to try anything else by her at this point. And it also, again, gave me a lot less faith in the list, and I'm starting to wonder, looking at it, wait, how are you recommending series that only have one book out? Which is something, I'll get to another example of that. This book I got, and he wrote the second book, and then he still hasn't finished the series. And this is, I've heard enough good things about even just this first book that I may still try to read it. And I have two other books in the NPR list that I have not read, but I have heard enough really good things about them that I am likely to try to read them at some point. And those are The Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which honestly, the idea is uplift, and I just don't like reading books this long in paperback, and I could not find, like, at all, much less an affordable version in hardcover, so I had to get this version, and that's why I put it off. It's the same reason I put off reading Ian Banks' Culture series, which is a series I want to read. They are long books in paperback, and I don't like reading long books in paperback, although trade paperbacks honestly aren't too bad. If it was mass market paperback, it would be really insufferable. And then Fifth Season, again, I've heard really good things about it, and I may well try to read it at some point. But these three books, so these two, and Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James, which it seems like nobody's actually read the second book, and he's probably not going to finish the third book anytime soon, but heard enough good things, I might still read this book as a standalone novel and see how it is. But aside from those three books, the other books that I have not yet read in this NPR list, I'm probably not going to read. And then there's the final thing about the NPR list, which is I have realized there is something that as a result of this list I call MFA creative writing fiction. And I had three examples that I wanted to use, but I couldn't find my copy of one of them, which was, I think it's the, Texacolin series. The first book is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, I think. And I loved that series at a time. Really interesting world building, but completely forgettable, and I have no urge to reread it. And that was one of the better books put out by someone with an MFA in creative writing. I think she had an MFA in creative writing, I'm not sure. She might not have, but there were a lot of mediocre books, not just from the NPR list, but also Amazon was recommending them, or other people were recommending them as similar, where I realized these are books that I would describe as being flawless, but not that great or even good a lot of the time. And so two other examples of this series that I really liked at the time, and then they're forgettable and I have no urge to reread them. One of them is John Scalzi's Interdependency, and Scalzi is one of those writers where I will read him, I will enjoy him, and then I'll be like, he was completely forgettable. What was interesting in the series? And I keep picking him up. Some of his books have actually disappointed me, but Old Man's War and The Interdependency were both enjoyable reads, but forgettable. I don't think I'd want to reread them. And I'm like, okay, this honestly was kind of, I think, a waste of time for me. And then Martha Wells' Murderbot, I'd heard so many good things about it. I loved it. I read all the books I got my hands on, immediately, as soon as I got them, including the new ones. And then with this latest one that I have, I don't know if she's done more after this, but this was the first one where I'm like, I just don't feel like she's saying anything interesting enough to keep reading the series, so I still have not read this one, or any books that came after this in the series. And then the science fiction fantasy reading group I attend picked the first 2 Murderbot books, I think, and I was like, I don't feel like rereading them. It's a compelling read, but there is no urge to reread them. And I'm not saying there's not a place for books like these 2 where it's enjoyable and you don't want to reread them. I've read the first 5 Dungeon Crawler Carl books, and that's sort of a similar thing where they're very enjoyable. I don't think I'm going to want to reread them, and I don't know if I will finish the series. But these are not the kind of books I want to prioritize. And so putting it all together, basically, the NPR list, I noticed, first of all, you had books like Black Sun that were just... It's an unfinished series where she ends on a cliffhanger that changes everything. And yes, the world building is interesting. It's not interesting enough to make up for how much I hate this in a book, or for the fact the series isn't finished, and you don't know if it will be finished, as with the Marlon James book. And then you have, again, Becky Chambers, where I read these first 2 books, and this one had promise, but didn't quite fulfill it, and then this one didn't fulfill that promise. It seemed to lose a lot of the soul of the original one, and now, again, I'm hearing good things about Monk and Robot, and because the NPR list recommended so strongly this series, I'm a lot more reluctant to read the Monk and Robot series, even though I've heard much better things about it. Then you have the books, and again, Scalzi and Wells and Texacolin, I think. And these are the ones I'm picking because they were good. I loved these series when I read them, and yet now I'm like, they were kind of forgettable and don't have staying power. And there are a lot of others that are more what I would say is what I call MFA creative writing fiction, where they weren't even that interesting at the time, and as soon as I was done, I kind of forgot about them and wasn't recommending them to anyone. And so, based on this experience, I basically took away... This was a list that was... Like, this book had just come out when the list was out, and it was based on the promise rather than the series. And then Murderbot, and especially, like, Interdependency, and I think also the Texacolin series, even though they are enjoyable reads, I don't know that they have enough to have staying power. And that doesn't mean I won't read books without staying power. Again, I read the first 5 Dungeon Crawler Carl, might or might not read more. It's just I'm a lot less willing to do that. And so I compare this with books that are considered sort of classics that I have read. And even if I don't want to read more, like I read the first Robin Hobb Assassins book, and I've heard Live Ship Traders is better, but you need to read Assassins first. And it's like, I don't know that I liked this book enough to read 2 more of these books to get to the supposedly really good Live Ship Traders. But the Assassins trilogy is memorable. And similar things for like Eleanor Arnason's A Woman of the Iron People, which is a classic-ish science fiction book that I read around the same time. And so you have books like this where they have the staying power because they're older, but the people compiling lists like this will base recommendations based on promise, or base them based on, yeah, it's a really enjoyable book to read at the time, but it may not end up really having staying power because there's nothing that interesting. As I said, I have this phenomenon. I'll probably make a video about the difference between flawless and great, because there are a lot of works that are technically flawless, but very mediocre. And so this experience with this list, my original plan was I was going to read everything on it, at least a couple books in every series if there was a series. And now I'm at the point where I read about a third of the list, and now of the books I haven't read, the only 3 that I still plan on probably reading are Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, 5th Season by M.K. Jemisin, and this Marlon James book, not as the series, because again, series isn't finished, and most people who've reviewed it have only read the first book anyways, but based on that this is apparently, I've heard, a good book as a standalone novel. And all the other books on that series that I have not read, I'm like, yeah, I'm just not gonna. And so that was sort of a lesson, and it was arguably helpful because it did expand. I read things that I might not have read and realized this exists, but it also got me very much in a place where I'm like, yeah, this is why I'm avoiding newer books and lists of books based on newer books. And again, the thing that really, really gets me is this book came out right before the list, and there's a lot of promise in the world building, but I consider the way she ended it unacceptable. And then she did the same thing with the second book in the series. And it's like, this is like, again, I'm basically blacklisting the author because of this, because I don't care how good your world building is, I do not consider this acceptable for writing. And again, the other books, it was more... A lot of them I liked, and again, I loved Murderbot, and I loved the Interdependency, and I loved Texacolin, whatever it is, too. But there wasn't really anything in them that has staying power to be like, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily I mean, I might recommend them if you want just a diversionary read. Yeah, read these books. But when I'm recommending books to people, I'm trying to recommend the books that are really excellent, really original. And most great books are not flawless, but they have something that stands out. And often the flaws are part of what make them stand out because they're experimenting. And this experience was, again, why I have mostly stopped reading older books. And there were some books I discovered in this list that were actually really good and I would recommend, but this video is about how this NPR list got me to avoid newer books. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.